Okay, well, we've got everyone in place. Thank you so much for coming to what I think will be a really important and interesting panel today. My name's Astrid Nordin, and I'm a professor here at the Lao China Institute. And today, I hope you're all here to listen to this panel that we're going to have, interrogating what the implications might be of China's rise as an information superpower for conducting critical research on Chinese politics and society. The roundtable is something we put together in order to consider what it might mean to conduct critical research on Chinese politics and society today in our current predicament. Of course, this is a task that is decidedly different from conducting research that is uncritically critical of China, right? So hopefully that criticality is something that we'll talk a little bit about what we might mean by it in this panel. And it's also a task that I think has become both more complicated and more urgent in light of the ambition under President Xi Jinping to cement and augment China's rise as an information superpower. So I'm hoping that this discussion will be of interest to a kind of quite varied audience that we have here today. We're going to do it quite conversationally. We're not going to give you presentations, but I'll raise a number of questions that I'll ask each of the panelists to respond to in turn, and we'll leave about half an hour at the end of the panel for Q&A as well. So before we launch into that, I want to introduce the panelists to you. Beside me here, I have David Tobin, who is the lecturer in East Asian Studies at the University of Sheffield, after previously working at the universities of Manchester, Glasgow, and Nottingham, England, and studying language at Peking University and Xinjiang University. And his work is located in the overlap between Asian studies and global international relations, using critical theory to frame results of detailed empirical fieldwork on the politics of identity and the everyday. Next to him, we have Dr. David Stroup, who's the lecturer of Chinese politics at the University of Manchester, after previous work at the University of Oklahoma. Now, his current research draws on ethnographic and interview data that he's gathered in China and focuses on how the renegotiation of ethnic boundaries in ethnic pre-Muslim communities interacts with China's state policies on ethnic and religious identification. He's also developing research on the everyday foundations of populist Islamophobia in China. At the end here, we've got Dr. Hannah Theaker, who's a lecturer in history and politics at the University of Plymouth, after previous work at the University of Oxford. Her work explores empire, rebellion, migration, and the co-construction of religion and ethnicity in China's northwest, with a particular focus of her current work. First of all, on the impact of 19th century state-directed resettlements of Muslims, and a strand of her current work that also explores the impact of contemporary Sinicization of Islam campaigns among Chinese-speaking Muslims. Last but not least, on the screen, we have Professor William A. Callahan, who is the Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. His work has won several prestigious prizes, including in 2022, the Best Book Award from the International Political Sociology section of the International Studies Association for his book, Sensible Politics, Visualizing International Relations, which is the first book-length analysis of visuality, multisensory politics, and international relations. And he also makes documentary films, including Great Walls, Journeys from Ideology to Experience, and You Can See China from Here. So that's our panel today. We've got a range of really interesting backgrounds. With that, we will launch into our first question to the panel. So I'd like you to all please address in a few minutes what you think are the limitations of researching issues of social concern to Chinese citizens inside and outside the PRC in Xi Jinping's new era. I'm asking you, how does the closure of some topics and openness in other areas shape knowledge production on China, including for us writing and researching from here in the UK. So David, do you want to open on this topic?
Thank you everyone for coming. So today I'm going to address that question really by trying to address why the limitations on research are so important. And I'm going to do that by highlighting some of my own personal experiences of transnational repression in that British academia. The two problems we face are intellectual and normative. Mainstream China studies can become a fundamentally uncritical, potentially anti-intellectual project, because often the terms of its inquiry are not up for debate. You cannot ask, what does it mean to be Chinese? Who is Chinese? Who is included? Who's excluded? The types of questions that we are trained as critical theorists to use. According to Hong Kong national security law, that is an act of terrorism to deconstruct that. That's as simple as that. That means research is shaped where, yes, you can go and conduct research in China, but it cannot be critical. You can do problem-solving theory, you can answer a focused question, why something happens, but you cannot dig deeper into how this happened. For example, we are constantly asked what caused the 2009 violence in Urumqi, where I was living, doing my field work. We're able to ask what caused it. We're able to say, oh, this specific event happened on that day, but we can't ask how that happened. What are the underlying ideas that made that possible? What are the underlying forms of governance and racial targeting that made that possible? Those are questions that are not permitted. Similarly, this is why former camp detainees are asked, what did they do? What did you do? As if there is a causal mechanism caused their detention, when we know the system is an arbitrary detention. There are no reasons. Their people are targeted because they are Uyghur and because of their identity. The debate is allowed on these topics. In fact, it's encouraged in some senses by the party. It's called managed pluralism, of course, in science literature. I do think that's a sanitized version of saying it's still Leninism. Some topics are allowed, some topics are not. So of course, right now we see lots of scholars being encouraged to go to Xinjiang who are not experts in the region, but never lived there. That's welcomed by the party. Obviously, people like myself who lived there, have done the research, will not be welcome. But the debate that will ensue, and that has ensued, really reproduces the party state's racial hierarchy that it creates inside China, partly by producing partial knowledge, but also by preventing ethnic minority authors from participating in those debates. We simply can't have our colleagues from Xinjiang come here and be here today. Rahel Edawut, our good colleague, is now in prison for life for being a Uyghur ethno-Muslim. He should be here talking instead of me, but that's just possible. All of these issues are not new, but they've become intensified under Xi Jinping. His sort of approach to ethnic policy was, we're going to solve the ethnic problem once for all. Of course, you also have a rise of electronic surveillance. But ultimately, all this is just being intensified. It's all just being implemented, obeyed, or resisted by people. New technologies, new tactics, but underlying thinking and methods are not necessarily entirely new. And we know that the topics of Uyghurs in Xinjiang have been sensitive for some time. Xi Jinping describes any issue related to the region as related to national security. Any form of discussion on the topic whatsoever is related to every aspect of China's national security. So it means discussing this in this forum, this is deemed a national security. I am breaking the Hong Kong national security law by talking about this, and you might be by interrupting. That's been made quite clear in Xinjiang policy, what's called Xinjiang policy, by people like Zhao Kezhi, head of the PSB, also Ma Xinrui, the party chief for Xinjiang, who says Xinjiang policy's focus now is international. We consider the domestic element to be completed, at least to be stable. The period of rounding up all those who should be rounded up, as Chen Chuan-Guo called it, has now shifted to international, to preventing Uyghurs from making connections with the Islamic world, also with democracies, specifically highlighting academic research. This is kind of stated quite explicitly, and this has effects. One effect being, one university I worked at, a research project was specifically targeted to the university was threatened by the party. The administrator that took the call was based in China. He concluded that he was not in danger, but that it came from the central government, and they were warned, if you promote or publicize any research on the region, there will be consequences. Same language we found in the transnational repression report. ordinary Uyghurs being separated from family and then called and told, if you don't change your behavior, there will be trouble. You'll be on the wrong path. That's in language, but thrown at my university I worked at. Universities have no mechanisms for dealing with that. There's nowhere to talk to. You get told you can have a chat with X person, with that person. No matter how many times you say this is very sensitive, trust, there's no mechanism. So go have a chat. There's no mechanism. Reality tends to veer away from this subject altogether. And the support we do have is the friendship circle, not problems. Like I say, that is not new, but it has intensified. When I started doing, when I was ready to publish my book, I was instructed by a leading professor in an institute I had an office in not to share any of my research with the Foreign Office. Specifically, Foreign Office diplomats were visiting the city I was working in, and I was instructed not to share my research with them under any circumstances. Of course, I have, but I did not that day. One of the aspects of that type of, that's sort of formal censorship, but another way that works is not necessarily direct censorship. It's sort of marginalizing the subject. And I'd be introduced to people as I write about Uyghurs, not China. My book, the dependent variable in my book is China, about China, how China categorizes Uyghurs, how it governs Uyghurs. It's not Uyghurs first. It starts with trying to explain Chinese politics. And that was seen as unwelcome. It's safe if you're marginalized along with the marginalized people. This is a niche expert subject, but once you attempt to say, this is how we need to understand China, and that would be my argument for the book. To understand China, you need to understand Xinjiang. You want to understand governance in China and make a case about how Chinese politics works, you need to know how different peoples are governed. It's the same as if we were to say, somebody's coming to Britain to study Britain, you're an expert in British studies, you don't just live in London, you're going to have to look at the makeup of Britain. Straightforward, non-controversial statement, but in this context, it's deeply problematic and deeply controversial. So what we kind of see in all this in terms of intellectual impact is a form of methodological nationalism, where this area studies approach and that same form of censorship really reproduces the party's teleology, that every aspect of anything that happened on the current territory of the PRC through history has led to today. And this is why we have China today. It was inevitable. And that without deconstructing these narratives, we can't really deconstruct that teleology. So we end up just reproducing what the party said. I have to emphasize that people like Du Weiming, mainstream Confucian historians, say to understand China, we need to look to the periphery. That's not controversial in China. This is straightforward, a history of imperialism where the different people were governed according to civilization, barbarian distinction. Not controversial when a Confucian historian says that. It's very controversial if I say. Last point I guess I'll make really, so that's an intellectual problem. It means we're intellectually hamstrung, we're not understanding China. And that phrase, understanding China, being used as a weapon to say you should have, not to say we should have a debate about what it means to be Chinese. Normatively speaking, that type of censorship and the prevention of allowing different people within China essentially to visit Britain and contribute to knowledge reproduces China's internal racial hierarchy here, where your colleagues can't come here and talk about their lives in a way that privileged and privileged British people can't. The Chineseness ultimately becomes defined by those who obey the party's rules for intellectual inquiry, and we don't get to deconstruct that privilege. I would argue we can't really conduct critical research inside China because scholars are forced into problem-solving theory. You go and do empirical focused research in a narrow area, but you can't really ask the bigger questions that we can frame the sciences and ask how did this happen? Not why is this happening right at this moment, but how did this state of affairs come to be? That is off the table if we want to go and do empirical research.
Thank you, David, for this powerful introduction to the topic that we're here to discuss today. And thank you also for sharing your own experience with us when other colleagues cannot be here to do so themselves. I'll hand over to David Stroup.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. I want to try and not replicate too much of what Tobin has just said. My thoughts are mostly going to be thinking about sort of knock-on effects about field closure and how that affects how institutionally we support and platform different kinds of research and what that means for knowledge creation and knowledge exchange. Obviously, during the COVID pandemic, we were in a period where field closure was a reality for absolutely everybody trying to study China. So it was almost as if there was this blanket notion that nobody was going back for a while. And this sort of allayed some of the conversations that those of us who work on what are considered sensitive subjects have been having amongst ourselves for several years now, as we've seen increasing authoritarian retrenchment under Xi and a sliding scale about what is considered sensitive or perhaps taboo. Those of us who are in these types of disciplines where we work on issues that may be considered sensitive have been concerned about going back for several years, possibly because we are concerned about interlocutors or people who might sponsor or help us coming under scrutiny that we cannot ethically put them through. And this is something that now that China is open again to transit from people from outside of China, there's a renewed conversation about can or should someone go back. One of the obvious consequences of this kind of field closure or differential field access is that it leads to a disparity of what we consider authority based on groundwork, field access, that kind of thing. We are in a discipline, either in area studies or area studies adjacent professions, where field access is sort of seen as the lifeblood and legitimacy that is bestowed on our studies. And there are going to be situations where people will be perfectly able to go back because their studies, I hate to use the word uncritical, but are not necessarily considered sensitive, right? And this is not a mark against anyone, but it's just a reality that there are certain knowledge inquiries that are not going to be deemed as antithetical to the state's interest or of sensitive natures. But one thing that I think that we all want to acknowledge and understand in looking back at previous eras of scholarship on China is that field closure and differential access are not unique concerns that have arisen solely during the Xi era, that we've been here before. We need to sort of look at some of the lessons that have come from past eras of scholarship. So for instance, during the Cultural Revolution, during the Hai Mao era, there was differential field access based on, in many cases, ideological preference of people who were going to study, so that some people got to go into the field while others found themselves locked out for very obvious reasons. These are scenarios which we see being replayed today with the added dimension of electronic surveillance, which means that even those of us who are standing outside the field may have difficulty interacting with people who are in China because of the notion that our communications may be monitored and we don't want to expose people to additional risk. So what do we do with this situation? And what do we understand that the consequences of this differential field access or field closure might be? If we look to the era of the 1960s, 1950s, and previous eras where this has been a reality, one thing that I think that we want to be certain to understand is that this does tend to create hierarchies of knowledge within the communities that platform us, that fund us, that give us the opportunity to speak, whereas people who are seen as having access to the field, having insight from on-the-ground interactions are prioritized as people who really know what's going on, when in fact that may be a complicated picture, that what is happening on the ground may be partial or incomplete, it may be managed, it may be, you know, a very different picture from what we see outside, and that those of us who are outside, while we may not be able to see into the field, are necessarily pulling back and seeing other patterns that are perhaps not visible to those who are in the midst of field work. In this sense, we need to be careful not to double blind ourselves, not to have prejudice against those of us who are by necessity working outside the field, and see that there is value in observing phenomenon, especially subjects that are considered sensitive, that might not be visible to those who are working on the ground in context. And for those of us who are standing outside the field, we need to be very careful not to out of hand dismiss work that is coming from field work. I think there is a tendency, and this is not casting aspersions at anyone in particular, but there is a tendency to think that people who are able to have field access must have somehow compromised their integrity or something else. And I think we have to be very careful about making those kinds of assumptions. One thing that I think we would all be well to remember is that there is a notion that field closure is only a factor for people who do sensitive work. And while I think there is a tendency for those of us who don't think we do sensitive work to assume that that will never be anything that we do, as we have seen over the last several years, certainly since the rise of Xi Jinping to power, we note that what is considered sensitive is a dynamic, fluid, and evolving situation. And oftentimes that designations of things that are considered sensitive may be done so suddenly and arbitrarily. When I started doing my work on Hui identity, particularly the everyday aspects of Hui identity rooted in cultural practice and everyday routine, I did not expect to find myself sitting at a table here in 2023 talking to you about why I don't think it's ethical for me to go back to China based on scrutiny that my research interviewees might encounter. Nonetheless, here I am. I think that that is a lesson that we all might want to think about, that the things that are considered antithetical to state interests are subject to sudden arbitrary change. This has been the case throughout history, and if we look at the past, we can learn from those lessons. We can also learn from the blind spots of previous attempts to navigate around some of these obstacles, but we need to make sure that we are not deriding work done from outside the field. There is a sense, I was speaking recently to a bunch of Russian scholars who look back on the era of Kremlinology as being fundamentally not valuable to the field, that it was all based on guesswork and hearsay. And I think if you actually look at the studies done during these periods, that isn't the case. But we need to understand that what we count as being valuable may be reflective of our own biases about what fieldwork access means. And we need to sort of have an ability to continue to ask grant institutions, funders to consider this work as being worth pursuing. And so one of the biggest consequences that I want to sort of highlight here is the idea that we need to be talking to our places of employment, our research officers, our ethics boards committees, letting them know that just because we are not planning to do field work in China, or just because we may have to operate outside the field due to sensitive issues, does not mean that we don't have something to contribute to the conversation, or that we should reorient our work towards something else. And likewise, to those of you who are heads of institutes, planners of panels like this one, be sure to include those perspectives, especially from people who are scholars from inside of China who find themselves now locked out of their home countries. People like David Tobin has mentioned already, people who are unable to go back to China because they face very real threats based on their holding PRC citizenship and being potentially considered dissidents. Platform those people as well. I think we need to be encouraging people to take this. I think that is where we're going to leave it for now.
Thank you very much. And over to you.
So I'm going to start this. I'm in the context of this. Well, I think I'd like to pick up on basically pointing out the ways in which we have to think about the architecture of the.
Hello, could you speak into the microphone, please?
Sure, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Is that better? So I think basically we're going to have to have a very clear idea of what the architectures of knowledge are going to look like across the field in order to tackle this. Like, we need a clear accounting of where we have good information, where we have bad information, what the exclusions are in the field, and that needs to be at the heart of all work that we do for that work to be intellectually valid. As a historian by sort of training and certainly personal inclination for all that, I have been brought into worlds that are not purely historical. I'm also putting out a plea here for basically people to be aware of that in terms of the information that is collected. So one of the things that is not new in my field is for archives that were available to become abruptly unavailable. That's been going on for like 10 to 15 years. We know about that. But increasingly, that is a very noticeable concern in terms of access to information coming out of China at the moment. Of course, there was a whole tranche of databases that were taken offline earlier this year. There's also been like much less well-publicized instances where things that had been published in places that you expect them to remain published. So like the digital edition of the People's Daily, for instance, the speeches off of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have been retrospectively removed, like quite large tranches of information in this case. And we need to be alert for where that's happening. And I would actually put out a plea for any archivists, librarians, or anyone who has access to those people to please consider starting to collect paper again. Because fundamentally, we're going to need that as the PRC moves to assert ever tighter control over the discourse realm. I'd also want to suggest that, so I spent some of the past few days thinking about Xi Jinping's thought on culture. Sort of building off what my colleagues have said here, I want to suggest actually we're moving into a world where, given how that discourse is constructed, it is possible that we're not going to be dealing with a world of sensitive and insensitive topics any longer, because fundamentally everything is framed as critical to the interests of the party state. This is a party that has quite explicitly basically associated Chinese civilization to itself. And in terms of how it's putting forward that message, it is claiming sort of like the discourse power, the power to create the narrative, to tell China's stories well. And if you look at the word in Chinese, like Huayuquan, that literally means basically the right to speak, the right to tell stories at all. And the party is claiming that position for itself and the position that goes with it. And that fundamentally means that for those of us who work on history and culture, nothing's out with that realm potentially. The mere act of, it's also this in Xi Jinping's sort of thought on culture, this is framed as a global ability to speak for Chinese communities everywhere. It is not limited by territory. It is a civilizational claim that claims the right to interpret sort of all of that for everybody. And it has subsumed sort of basically a nationalism to the party itself. It's probably based in a very narrow ethno-national vision of what China could be, what China is, what China has been. And that really means that, therefore, the mere act of speaking about China as a scholar who is not taking on sort of party state stances could become a critical act. And I don't think that means that every single one of us needs to interpret that into the heart of our scholarship. I think that means actually that talking about Chinese identity in different ways without reference to Xi Jinping thought on culture or to like the party state rhetoric on what that ought to be is going to become a critical act. And I think therefore we need an awareness in what we're doing of basically how sort of our narratives have the potential to present alternative Chinas, whatever those look like in all of their variety, and to actually sort of present that to the world, partly really as a bulwark against where this is heading, which is sort of the idea that China is so exceptional that we cannot talk about it at all. So it's a duty, I think, that actually belongs to the entire field, like no matter where you think your research sits in that. To a large extent, there is a world in which like attempting to speak apolitically about China is going to become as critical an act as any other act of speech.
Thank you for really thought-provoking comments there, Hannah. Bill, over to you.
Thank you, everyone. I apologize, I can't be there today. I think I'll start off from something that David was just talking about, in that we've been here before. That after 1949, most people, not just Westerners, but most people were cut off from China until basically the 1970s. And then in 1989, when I was a young PhD student, I couldn't go to China. I couldn't do field work. I had to reorganize my PhD around something theoretical and historical because I couldn't go to China. And then 2019, again, first COVID, now kind of increasing concerns of national security laws in Hong Kong and mainland China. One of the interesting things, if you think back to what happened after 1949, especially, is the focus of research shifted from China to overseas Chinese. So like one of the kind of major historians of China named William Skinner, he just switched to overseas Chinese. It was a fascinating thing. And I think that we'll be seeing some of that. That raises its own issues and problems, but it's something to look for. I mean, the problem of access is always an interesting one. And I'm always a little anxious when people talk about access, because in China studies in particular, there's this fetishization of connections, of guanxi. Oh, I know the right people. And oh, I go and find out sort of secret information over a beer, that kind of thing. And I'm just always, that makes me uneasy because it's of course very gendered often, that men going out and drinking beer. But it's also just you know, it already excludes people who may not want to do that kind of thing. I don't want to stress that too much, but it also makes me think about why I haven't gone to China for quite a few years now. And before, I mean, what is new now is that the risk is not just to the people that we talk to. It used to be, oh, we have to be careful about the people in China that we talk to because they'll get in trouble potentially. In the past few years, it's been more about we researchers, me and the other panelists, we could get in trouble, especially since the Canadian was kidnapped and held hostage. I think that was in 2019. That was a real wake-up call. So that's one issue. The other issue is when I go to China, if I go to China and I talk to, can I actually get any interesting information anymore? Will people be able to talk to me and say interesting things that I don't already know? Are there any, I used to go to the bookstore and look at the interesting books and, buy the latest volume of Xi Jinping thought. I don't think that's the way Chinese academia works anything. Everything is online. Everything is on Aisisiang, the website with the top essays, academic essays. So it makes me wonder why do I need to go to China? I don't do field work in the way, I guess, an anthropologist or a sociologist would. I go and talk to my academic colleagues. So for me, it's the value of going is not as much as it used to be. Let's see. I have a lot more to say, but maybe I should just finish up and open it up to Q&A. One thing I wanted to say is that I'm involved in a project that's funded by the British Academy and is called Chinese Global Orders. And it's very deliberate about being plural. It's not just China's global order, it's many Chinese global orders, many Chinas, many orders. Astrid gave me a hard time about this in the title of one of my books. I called it something like China Dreams. And she said, it should be China's Dreams, pluralized China. You remember that, Astrid? Anyway.
I remember.
You remember. Yes, it's a good comment. I don't think it works as a book title, but there you go. And I guess what we're doing in the Global Chinese Orders and also in my own work is looking at China not just as within the boundaries of the PRC, but also China as a global actor, the global politics of China. And so that means that when we study China, it's not just in Xinjiang or in Beijing, but it's in Addis Ababa, it's in Buenos Aires, it's wherever Chinese government and business and social groups are kind of doing stuff. And that actually liberates us from the concern with whether we have adequate field work because we can't get to China. We can do field work somewhere else, and we can talk to Chinese people in Argentina as well as in Nanjing. And that in a way has been quite liberating. It doesn't solve the problem of access, but it transforms it. And I think in interesting ways. Let's see. I guess the last thing I would say is that from a practical policy point of view, Beijing making it difficult for some of us to go to China will have unintended consequences. And one of them, which are not favorable to Beijing's view, one of them is some of us are just going to Taiwan. And we go to Taiwan, we go and look at the archives, we go and talk to people. Taiwan is, once you learn about Taiwan, you realize it's not an alternative China. Taiwan is its own thing, but it's not completely separate from China as if we think of it in terms of Sinic culture or Sinophone identity. And I guess what is interesting is that people generally go to Taiwan, they have a good experience, and they're like, oh gosh, I don't really buy this one China policy anymore. Anyway, I'll stop there, and I look forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Bill. I've got a number of questions. We'll see how many of them we manage to move through. But what I will do is invite the panelists to answer the questions if they want to. I'll ask you a question in turn, and then you let me know if it's one that you feel like you want to further address. So the first question that I'm interested in asking, if you want to comment further on, is what it might mean to do critical research specifically on China. What are the limits and possibilities of conducting critical research inside and outside of China in this age of electronic surveillance? Now, a number of you have touched on this already, but would any of you like to make further comments on this question?
I'm being looked at by
David,
both of these people next to me, so I
you
feel
please move up the microphone as well, just to make sure everybody hears.
I think one thing that I would encourage us all to think about is that, certainly there are limitations that we face on doing critical work, and to tie in some stuff that I've already mentioned, does critical scholarship get funded? Does critical scholarship get platformed? Does critical scholarship get celebrated in the way that scholarship that might be less controversial or less likely to, jeopardize relationships do, right? So that's obviously a limitation that comes to the forefront. One other thing that I think is maybe important to consider is that the limitations that we are facing here, those of us at this table, are certainly context rooted, but they're not necessarily unique to people who study China. I think one of the things that we might benefit from is developing a series of conversations with people who are in comparative context facing similar aspects of field closure. One of the things that I have benefited extremely at great length from in recent years is speaking to a former mentor and colleague of mine who's an expert on Russia, talking to colleagues in my department who are scholars of Ukraine, talking to colleagues of mine who do contentious work in the United States or the United Kingdom about the lack of, the limitations of doing critical scholarship in those arenas as well. As we think about how to live with these new realities of digital surveillance, of field closure, differential field access, this is an effort that we are not necessarily uniquely facing, and that outward engagement with other communities that find themselves locked out of the field by nature of politics, by nature of war, by nature of just practicalities, also have things to contribute and understand. And so having these sort of dialogues to help us consider where we can develop strategies for how to understand, for instance, if online data is valid or is the subject of AI manipulation or bots. A comment that I've gotten on much of my recent research, which has moved to ethnography, thinking about how to determine validity if we are doing studies of communities in diaspora where selection bias may be an issue. These are things that happen not just to people who study China, but to people who study Russia, to people who study Ukraine, to people who study conflict in the US. Like there are a lot of things that we can learn from each other. And so sort of breaking out of our idea that China is uniquely challenged in this way is important, I think. And maybe that's where I'll start.
Anybody else?
I sort of addressed most of the question, but one point I'll make that is something you mentioned in the introduction that's important. When I'm talking about critical theory, we're not talking about being uncritically critical of China. I would say that's actually really easy to do. When I was getting ready to publish my book, an IR-based colleague told me, just say China's going to collapse. You'll make loads of money. That's what the West wants to hear. You can just say that. It doesn't matter. Just do it. I could have done that. It would be easy. I was just teaching on China threat theory this week, so I was giving the students slides on all these various China threat books and showing them real stuff, but also then finding, China's secret space program. China's going to drink all the wine in the world. China's going to reanimate dinosaurs and send them to Europe, this kind of stuff, that you can do and you can make a living off. So that's not what we're talking about. That stuff's just playing around. We're not talking about bashing. We're talking about actually using critical theory, constitutive theory. It doesn't have to be post-structuralist, but just asking how questions, how do things happen? And that is what I'm concerned about.
I feel like I sort of said my bit on what I think critical means. Did that first time around. I think. No, I do feel like I said my bit on what I think critical means. I think in that sense, yes. I think awareness basically of our own positionality of the research and awareness basically of your own positionality, the positionality of your sources and the positionality to which you're speaking is going to be crucial for producing a world in which like critical research can be done, in which critical research is meaningful. Like, I think I want to see that at the core of everything that is done. I've had it to my back teeth, stuff that claims it's objective and it's going to solve everything through numbers. I think in that sense, the world needs to take basically some lessons from our qualitative colleagues about understanding precisely where everything is in order to actually produce an accurate interpretation of the world. And that means applying that critical lens to our scholars, to our sources, and to where we're getting things from, but also to ourselves, and also to the environment in which we speak. It's sort of that world in which to be apolitical, you have to be really, really political to begin with. I'm tying myself in knots now, but I know what I mean.
Thank you. A really thought-provoking way of putting that as well, Hannah. Bill, do you want to come in further on this question of criticality and what it might mean in this context?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I think about a lot. I'll follow from what I think it was David who said, it's looking at how China does things. And I would say that a less critical or more mainstream way of looking at things tries to answer the question, what is China? Like it's a thing out there that we can point to and explain objectively. And the critical approach that I think is useful is asking who is China, where is China, when is China, how is China? And as Hannah said, being reflective about that. I mean, coming from critical IR, critical international relations, I find that most critical IR is about deconstructing Western hegemony or Orientalism, how the West has constructed the East and used concepts as a way of governing the East through empire. And I've done that, and it's really interesting. But I think that there's a lot of critical work to be done about how power in China works in similar ways, not exactly the same, but it's similar ways. And I would suggest that the party state is the chief Orientalist right now. It's not some Western thing, that it's Beijing is putting out Orientalist views of China, Orientalist views of the world. And that's why I think it's good to kind of deconstruct Chinese views of self and other in ways that a lot of the panelists do alongside me. And so that kind of shifts the critique from just talking about the West and deconstructing the West to thinking about, if China is a global power, then, you know, Chinese views of the other, of the foreigner, of the outside are interesting and important. And, you know, I just, as an example, I just published an article that looked at these issues by looking at Chinese images of big-nosed foreigners and that kind of thing, and how this traces view and is different. It's not a singular view, but it can tell us something about the broad sense of Chinese foreign policy as how Chinese actors engage with the other. Yeah, that's. I mean, it's always interesting to talk about what we mean by critical. The first thing I tell my students and my non-academic friends is critical doesn't mean you're criticizing and saying bad things. It's like the panelists said, it's like being more reflective and more complex about how you understand things. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like us to move on to questions of responsibility in all of this, and perhaps draw out some concrete suggestions for us, for people in the room, about how different actors who are involved in this question of knowledge production might step up to those responsibilities in ways that we recommend. So first of all, our employers. How can universities in the UK enable research that is considered sensitive to the party state? And what responsibilities do they have to censored and imprisoned colleagues, as mentioned earlier, in the PRC, who are producers of knowledge on China? Those of you who can engage with this should be, again, open to you, David,
Sure.
and then move down the line.
I mean, the practical thing, yes, is the update of code of practice on academic freedom. That is British law, but some universities haven't done that. Doing that. It's taken for granted, and I've had these conversations with freedom is something you have and do it. When of course it's not something protected, and this is one of those things. So that for the practice is not, that law is not passed because of China, for all that do. But universities, not only have they not, some have not actually updated their practice at all, they're not really wanting to engage with kind of specific issues. When I raise these issues at universities, I'm saying, oh, you can talk to your other colleagues that work on human rights in my and I do, that's really important for my work, but it doesn't help my life in terms of my freedom to be what I want. It's no different because Myanmar has no power in it. Whereas the party state does. We know it's about universities making themselves dependent on international institutions. The fault lies with bad management, not with students. They made this a business model, and now they feel the whole thing to it. I've worked in institutions where I'm told in the person, if we upset China, we go back. That's unacceptable. It's bizarre to tell somebody like me that. I wonder what to talk about behind closed doors. But really, that we need to update the way the law is implemented, but also those China-specific dimensions that have been ignored. In terms of the responsibility to colleagues, I mean, we need basically more people with more power to do something about this that can bring universities together. People with universities that want to jump. SOAS has jumped in defending the rights of Rahela Dawood, but that's because, of course, Rahela Dawood is doing the joint research project with Paris at SOAS funded, so they felt specifically responsible, but there's no reason why every university. I imagine David can comment on that to talk about the law, but there is a big issue with how our research is risk assessed and how collaboration is encouraged.
Yeah. I think this is where I would jump in to not totally repeat what Tobin has said, but to kind of angle it towards related, but not exactly identical subject. I mean, one of the things that I think all of us assembled here on this panel felt really deeply was the chilling effect caused by the life sentence that we found out that he had been sentenced to. And one of the things that really struck me in a moment of, I think, consideration about conversations of responsibility in terms of institutional responsibility and ethical responsibility that we are encouraged to consistently think about are norms related to reciprocity. And anybody who has ever filled out an ethics evaluation form or an IRB form, if you're from the States like me, you've been asked at some point about how you will share and disseminate research, how you will engage in reciprocity, how you will be a part of the community, giving back to scholars that you have worked with, interlocutors in the field. This is sort of the core of knowledge exchange, that we are constantly asked to think about reciprocity as a matter of academic principle. So I ask all of us to think about, what does that mean for us in standing up for colleagues who are being scrutinized, marginalized, imprisoned, or pressured by authoritarian states? What are our universities who encourage us to give back to the communities we work in want us to do about the fact that people that we work with are being repressed for being critical and open about what they do? I've spoken to colleagues about this in the weeks since the news was revealed about Rahela Dawood's sentencing. And the idea that was sort of bandied about in some of the conversations that I had was that, it's not necessarily going to be feasible or possible for every department, every university to make a statement because, you know, why would they jump into something that they might not have a stake? After all, you know, not everybody hosted, not everybody was, you know, in a cooperative research project. And I think that that is an understandable position to take, but one that we all need to sort of question and think about. If we are asking our academic researchers to be invested in these norms of reciprocity, then we need to consider speaking up for their colleagues when they are detained. And many of us do have connections to people who are, you know, suffering the consequences of exercising their academic freedom in a place where it's not guaranteed. So we need to think about that. I'd add one caveat to this, and I'm not sure, or not caveat, one addition to this, and I'm not sure if this is necessarily the place to do this, but thinking about risk assessment and risk management is an integral part of this conversation as well. I think as those of us who have done field work in recent years or have had to do ethics approval, even on projects that aren't going into the field, the idea of where risk is and who is susceptible to risky situations is something that needs to be dramatically rethought in light of field closure, in light of electronic surveillance, in light of pressure from politics entering into the academic sphere. And I don't know anybody who I've talked to in the last several years who is doing work on an authoritarian state who doesn't think that our current ethics review processes or IRBs are really fit for purpose for dealing with this kind of pressure. And so one thing that may be responsibility for all of us is to start having conversations with our ethics review boards about why some of the practices that are considered best practices or working in contexts where there is, you know, transparency and rule of law and you know, the idea of due process according to Western and liberal standards, even if those are not always upheld, right? Cynically, we can understand that those are not always upheld even in liberal democratic states, but like still the systems are designed to work in those contexts. We need to think about how and when they need to be adapted to change and suit the realities that we now find ourselves in if we study states like China where those things are not necessarily good. And I'm sure I'm stepping on some of the things.
Yeah. So I think I kind of want to pick up with both of those points about saying that fundamentally, like, we do need reform to ethics and risk processes. However, it needs to be done carefully and it needs to be done well. We've had a big drive recently for building China capacity in the government among civil servants, like the recognition that basically in the UK, a lot of the people who are sort of most trusted with developing China policy and dealing with all of that really don't know enough about what they're doing and what they're encountering. And also that basically sort of this spreads throughout kind of different bits of government. You've got to have like quite a broad-based kind of knowledge and awareness of China to actually basically deal with what you're looking at, to understand what you're looking at a lot of the time. I would add that that actually, I think, also applies to university administrations. Mostly because right now I've been through a series of conversations with various people in my institution, which mostly exist of me trying to explain things to people who, in some cases, are working off basically mistaken information. They're working off basically threat narratives that they've got from other places. They're working off sort of outdated ethics issues that do not necessarily apply to me. And then when basically I take sort of my research to them, this becomes my problem to try and explain and interpret. And I am like, my instinct in this case is basically to say that in my particular position, I am the only person that's qualified to talk about this even vaguely in my institution. I am the only person employed there who works on the history and politics of China at all. However, I understand that from the perspective of my university, maybe they would like to be able to check what I'm saying with somebody else. But that calls for basically a much sort of stronger set of norms and awareness and kind of basically a process for educating administrations about what they're dealing with in order that we can actually accurately produce kind of a response within institutions to these actually quite nuanced issues of like basically credit for Chinese colleagues who absolutely deserve it, speaking up for Chinese colleagues, support for our research, support for academic freedom, and an accurate understanding of what the risks actually are and where they're actually located. Because right now I am not seeing that in the people that I'm working with, well-meaning as those people are.
Thank you. Bill, would you like to come in on this question of what our employers and universities might do to ameliorate the situation that we're in?
Oh, I guess so. Like a lot of people, I've been talking to senior members of my university about Rahila DeWitt's incarceration and life sentence, and it's quite interesting because often we're told that the university does not have a foreign policy. The university doesn't comment on individual things unless there is some connection, close connection. And the other thing is, people tell me that it's much better to do quiet diplomacy for universities as well as for the Foreign Office, and that grandstanding and kind of yelling out that something bad is happening just doesn't work. And I understand that, but what I would suggest is that the Chinese party state is deeply, deeply interested in what foreigners think of it, and it's deeply, deeply interested in its reputation, and that the kind of not grandstanding, but sort of a principled public statement can actually have an effect. It's not just this, because I'm often told, or we're often told, this is sort of empty grandstanding for your own ego, right? And it's not going to help anybody. But practice and experience has actually shown that, public relations is important in China, and sometimes it's good to say things publicly. I'll stop there.
Thank you. We've got a few minutes left before we open up to Q&A with the audience. And I'd like to pick up on one of Hannah's comments, which had to do with how we engage with policymakers and civil servants, particularly in this moment of a drive to build capacity for those groups around China. So what responsibilities and possibilities do you think that scholars have to engage with policymakers and civil servants on these issues, and particularly issues surrounding human rights in the PRC? And in doing so, how do we balance the independence of our research and the needs of policymakers? And I particularly wish for you, if you can, to comment on any advice you have for colleagues who might not consider themselves very well read or specialist on either human rights or ethnic policies in China. Somebody who might have been writing on Confucianism as our keynote speaker later this evening, for example. What is their responsibility, and what would you advise for them with regards to their own practices in their research, and particularly in relation to any interactions they have with policymakers and civil servants? Anna, do you want to come first, since this, I think, is your field?
I'm not sure this is my field, but sure. It's as much everybody else's field. Well, I mean, I've always felt this, actually. Like, academic research needs to be communicated, and it needs to be accessible to the people who are actually going to use it and to care about it. That basically should say nothing about the research agendas, because like, research is valuable when you have a full spectrum of research available. But I think basically there is no point the academy talking to the academy. I think actually that there is, and I accept that basically not all academics are going to want to do this, but we need public voices out there who are informed, who are expert, who are producing information in forms that people wish to read and wish to be aware of. I have to say that I personally have never encountered any conflict between sort of policymakers and like my own research. As I see it, my job is simply to communicate the things that I am seeing, that I am finding in my research, to an audience, and to do so in a way that they are going to be able to access. What they then do with that information is up to them. It's not up to me. The important thing is that I'm trying to do it and I'm trying to put it out there, I think. And I think for people who think of themselves as experts on other things, I think sometimes it's important to remember that I think we all have a duty to be informed and aware of the rest of the field. So if it's not your thing, point people who are interested in asking about that to where they are going to find that information. And that is something that we all should be able to do. Like, I mean, there is no point me going on about my research if that's not what they're looking for. At that point, I point them to the person who is the expert, who does have that information, who is able to give them the perspectives that they're looking for. And I think that's part of sort of the value of being academics, is that you point people towards the good information. It might not be what you have. And I think we do all have a responsibility to be informed about basically all of what's happening in our fields. I think we are intellectuals, we live in a connected world. Like, there is no point siloing ourselves. There's no point saying this is not the things we do, particularly as, like, when you go out into a wider world, very often you might think of yourself as being, in my case, somebody who does the 19th century politics of Gansu and really strongly believes in that. But very often when I go into a room, particularly in an institution where I'm not part of a China institute, I'm just like the China person on staff. I might not be the most expert, but I'm the only person in that room. And at that point, my responsibility to point people towards the good information where I know how to find it is redoubled, because I'm that point of access.
Thank you. David Stroup?
Sure. I think one thing that comes to mind immediately, right, thinking about how to encourage positive discourse with policymakers and people who are involved in sort of where the rubber meets the road in terms of how policy towards China and elsewhere are set, is one, I think it's important to encourage policymakers to decenter themselves from this conversation, so that when we're talking about matters of academic freedom and when we're talking about matters of human rights or what have you, it's important to remember that this is not an opportunity to score points for your own domestic political agenda, that these are not, this is not necessarily something to go do a bunch of like partisan, hackling about. I say this as obviously as an American citizen, and I think a lot of the politics surrounding China and the US have become subject to sort of meta narratives about what's going on in the US rather than how the United States engages with China. And so just, for one thing, as we start to engage our policymakers, I think we need to be very strident and specific that if they're going to comment on this, they need to do it from a place of trying to address the issues and not trying to, win the Iowa primary or whatever, right? So the one other thing that I would say in terms of just reaching out to colleagues who don't consider themselves experts or may not feel that it's their place to say something. One, to draw back to earlier conversations is, you never know what will be considered a sensitive issue. You never know what will be considered something that you might have reason to speak out on in the future. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't think about, what your responsibilities are to general principles of academic inquiry, academic freedom. These are things that I would hope, regardless of your discipline or regardless of what you do, that we would all feel strongly that we would like our studies to be able to be conducted without interference or without, undue pressure or things like that. And we can speak out for colleagues who do feel that they have been put in those positions. That's, while you may not be an expert in human rights, you can be a supportive and good colleague, right? One other thing that Tobin always says to me, and I'm going to steal a little bit of his thunder when he talks about, maybe I don't feel like I know how to speak to policymakers. Tobin, who is a very accomplished speaker to public-facing and policymaking audiences, always reminds me, when I started, neither did I, right? So that's not saying that you need to go, talk about things about, you don't know about, but that maybe you do know more than you think that you do. And, being a voice in the room doesn't mean that you have to lead the conversation, but that you can take part in it, right? I think that that's important. And I'm gonna toss it to you then.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, a lot of colleagues do ask me, like, how do you get into rooms with policymakers? How can I possibly do that? How can I learn that language? And as David said, well, I didn't know it either. It was just because I cared about the subject. I didn't have any connections in government at all. I kind of pushed my way into the door, and the timing was right that people wanted to know about something I know about and they don't. And that is regardless. I mean, obviously, I did a PhD using critical theory, where you are taught that you need to be very careful when you speak to policymakers. There can be compromises you need to make, but I have been pleasantly surprised in my work with policymakers, about how informed they are, because obviously we're not interacting with ministers like that. It's essentially people who are researchers who went into civil service. So they're interested in very similar things that I am. They just do have different jobs. So when I work with them, it's quite pleasant what they know. But it is also striking how little they know about issues related to human rights, specifically in Xinjiang and Tibet. Very little knowledge. So I do see it as our responsibility to share that. One compromise I made, looking also at critical theory, they'd all say, never give them recommendations, you must only give analysis. And I tried to stick to that, give them an analysis of how and why things are happening. I don't tell them what to do. If you want to get funding from a policy body and write a report, they will want you to put recommendations in. That's a compromise I was willing to make because there's a genocide. And I'm quite comfortable saying that. That is my political opinion. Genocide is bad. The first policy talk that I gave with, it was a team effort, myself, Ryan Thum, and Rachel Harris. After, I mean, this is our first time really doing that, and afterwards a cabinet advisor said that was the best talk we've ever heard on China. And we were really kind of surprised when we asked why. And from their perspective, two things. They said, you didn't lecture us and pontificate at us. We're used to being told what we couldn't possibly understand, and people lecture us about things we do understand. And it was evidence-based, which was a surprise again from someone using a lot of theory. They said this was unusual for someone focusing on China to share so much evidence. So I will remind people that it's easier than you think if there is a need for it. But also if you're someone who's uncertain about how governments work, or whether you think government is malevolent or benevolent, I would argue you need to share information on these subjects. You need to whether, regardless of what the government of the day is, regardless of what your perspective is on that, however you believe that government's intentions are, the world is going to be a safer, better place if people have the correct information. As simple as that you don't want governments acting on bad information, on a lack of information. That would make everyone unsafe. So there isn't really an argument not to share your research with policymakers. And just lastly, on the point about expertise, that's something really important, and that's going back to what I was saying about that cabinet advisor's comment. We are kind of bound when we do. I did a training course where essentially when you work with the media, when you do knowledge exchange, you have to tell people when you're not an expert. I can't go in a room and start talking about tax policy in Zhejiang. It's because I know China. That's not ethical. I have to say, okay, I can give you an opinion, but that's just not my expertise. This is my expertise. And there isn't enough of that humility. There aren't enough colleagues passing on jobs, essentially. When someone's called by the BBC, most people just do it. They want to be in the news, but it is really important what Hannah said. If this is not your area, pass it to your colleague. If someone, BBC, get in touch with me about Taiwan, I wouldn't do it. I would pass it to a colleague and see if they want to do it. I could talk about the broad issues, but I've never been to Taiwan, so I would not comment in that way. That's really important when we do that. It's important for your own reputation, but it's also important that the correct information is passed on.
Thank you. Bill, before we open up to Q&A, do you want to make any last comments in relation to this issue?
Well, everybody said really interesting things. I would just say that speaking to you as fellow professors and lecturers, there are ways that the university encourages this through the Research Excellence Format, REF, impact case studies. And that if you can convince your university that you can write a good impact case study, then they will help you and maybe give you funds. And there are ways of kind of using the system to to transfer academic research into more policy relevant things. And I think that's a good thing. I think it would be good to take advantage of these horrible institutions that we have in place, make them work for maybe a common good.
Wonderful. That's music to my ears as the person responsible for the impact case study in the next draft in my institution. Please speak to me afterwards. So with that joyful note, we will open up to the audience. I will take a number of questions and then we'll open to the panel for answers. Do we have this one? Sorry. Oh, maybe if you take that one and I'll hold on to this one. Right, gentleman at the front.
Thanks very much for the discussion. It was very informative. My day job, I'm an accountant. I'm not actually, despite my looks, I'm British-born Malaysian Chinese, so I speak from those perspectives. My first question is, what we're going through if we take helicopter view? Isn't that part of a bigger picture of the growing geopolitical conflict between US and China, starting from the trade war to the tech war and COVID, all that sort of thing? All of us are affected by it. Do you see it getting better? And second point I wish to make is, I've seen successful defenses. I know it's not like for like. MIT defended its Chinese colleagues against the China initiative policy. Maybe you could be inspired by that and find ways to protect those that you know.
Thank you. We've got a question at the back. Lady, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Santana Muthani. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for organizing this. So I am a scholar from Yanqing Academy in Beijing, and it's a Peking University. And and I'm also Kenyan. So what's interesting is, in this whole discourse, we see lots of talk of what China is doing in Africa, what China is doing in other rising or emerging economies. And something that I see academics, and especially those who are still academics now, is you find you're in a university with conflicting interests, and you don't have enough budget or enough funding to do research, say, on China. So in the economies that, you're seeing lots of China activity, you're seeing academics not even having the money to, go do independent research. And now what that puts them in a situation where China may be the only person who gives them funding. So they can't really be as independent in their reporting when it comes to things like human rights, when it comes to things, with, say, Xinjiang and, other geopolitical issues, say, like Taiwan and Hong Kong. So as, academics who, fully fledged in, the knowledge of China, how would you ameliorate such situations so that, we still keep that spirit of, academia alive?
Wonderful, thank you. And then we have a third question from the gentleman.
A fascinating panel. So we have talked about the responsibilities of academics, universities, as well as policymakers. But I wonder, what about the responsibilities of those academic organizations, such as organizations of China Studies, East Asian Studies? To what extent have we seen they have shown solidarities with scholars being prosecuted, or simply with broadly the critical China study communities who increasingly lose their access to the field? Thanks.
Thank you. We'll take a round of answers from the panel and then we'll return to opening up to the audience. You want to go first, Hannah?
Sorry, my sinuses are not happy with the world. Can you remind me what the questions were?
So we've got a question about the bigger geopolitical picture, one about successful defenses against encroachment from things like the China initiative at MIT. The third question about what to do for universities with little funding elsewhere in the world. And finally, about the responsibilities of academic organizations.
I'm going to leave the geopolitical questions to my geopolitical colleagues. However, I mean, certainly in terms of defense of Chinese colleagues, I think one of the major things that universities can do is remember that they have voices, and those voices are more powerful than they think. And that there comes a point where shouting loudly from the rooftops is absolutely the correct thing to do. And that applies absolutely to academic organizations as well. Like, there is a power in a collective voice, and that is what those organizations are supposed to do. And it has been quite disappointing in many cases how slow these institutions have been to respond. I think that's a product of the way in which certain issues are marginalized in the field. Like, they're seen as exceptional cases or cases that only apply to borderlands. And in many ways, precisely as David said at the beginning, they are kind of put in an intellectual zone of exclusion that means that too often these sort of the big associations are very slow to recognize that, in fact, these are core, these affect kind of everything about what we're doing. They ought to be at the heart of what we're doing, not at the edges. Like, it's not possible to study China without thinking about these things. Hopefully, like, these days, the pendulum has shifted a little bit, and it's becoming easier to get that sort of recognition out of sort of the big academic organizations. But it has been slow. I think sometimes that's also, yes, a product of the way in which Chinese studies has been framed. In terms of the question about funding for academic institutions that have very little, this is a really important issue, and I'm really glad to see it raised. Alas, I don't think this is necessarily confined simply to the global south or to areas in which China is doing a lot of business. I think the sad reality is that particularly in the UK, like, the financial bottom line is used as a justification for a lot of things. I think we need really a kind of reassertion of value around academic freedom to support that. I think we need also to look for innovative ways of funding. I would be really interested in hearing what proposed solutions to that might look like from everybody here. Like, I'm not certain I have any, but it's an absolutely crucial issue, and it's only going to get more important. It is, I think, of all of the issues that were raised in the panel about the ways in which sort of China's influence is structuring architectures of knowledge, inclusions and exclusions, that's probably the biggest one that was not mentioned to this point.
These are all really good and important questions. I want to start with the question about sort of China's funding of institutions that don't necessarily have resources. So I think this is a really excellent and well-made point. I may be showing my naivety a little bit here in terms of what I would want or what I would hope for. I think the answer to this is to reinvest in partnerships across the globe. I mean, I think, you know, doing research at all with a partner from another institution can be difficult. Hannah's at the University of Plymouth, I'm at the University of Manchester. We are currently having problems coordinating grant funding opportunities, and we're both in the UK, right? We're not really encouraged a whole lot to look outside of the UK for collaborative projects in other countries. And it's really hard. It's really bureaucratic, and it's I think something that administrators don't love to do because it feels like a lot of effort, and they are not convinced that the return is going to be great. But obviously the return is important, because if we want to ensure things like academic freedom, we have to be willing to establish constructive partnerships and say, like, we're not going to put knowledge limitations on how, you know, people across the globe discuss these things. I think we should be, you know, reaching out to people in other countries, whether that's, you know, in China or elsewhere, right? I think that building those networks are important, and I know that that's maybe a sort of an optimistic vision about like what universities are willing to do, but maybe we need to start pressing them to do that. And that's on our end. We need to start doing. In terms of concerns about geopolitics, I do want to say, I mean, I think obviously geopolitics have accelerated some of these questions, but I do want to say, I think that there are senses in which notions about sensitivity and field closure and tit for tat exchanges about academic freedom have been with us for a lot longer than just 2018 onward. There's a very famous example of the Xinjiang 13, who put out an edited volume in 2004, and all of them, including geologists who were talking about rock samples in the Taklamakan Desert, found themselves facing travel bans to China. So obviously, this predates Xi Jinping. It predates a lot of the current geopolitical tensions in the United States around the rivalry concerning the rise of China. These are questions that have been with us for a while. So I sort of want to step back from the idea that it's just about geopolitics, or it's just about geostrategic rivalry. I think obviously that has made these things more intense. And certainly, the rhetoric coming out of the United States, in particular about, viewing China as a threat to American interests doesn't necessarily help. This encouraging China to pull back. I'm a former Fulbright scholar, and when the United States pulled the Fulbright program out of China, I think it hurt the United States' ability to understand what was going on in China. I think that was an unforced error on the part of the United States. I do not think that necessarily means that we would have been seeing different types of outcomes had the United States not done that, right? I think Xi Jinping's move towards a more authoritarian system is part of a much longer running trend. Tobin probably has thoughts on this.
Yeah, on the geopolitics, it obviously matters very, very much to outcomes, though I'll say 2 points. One, if people that I know that work on US politics, you say geopolitics isn't really what matters, it's who's who and who's friends with who in Congress. Guanxi, but we wouldn't call it that. Secondly, it's only 11 years ago that I was sitting in a bar in Urumqi with a Uyghur, a Hui, and a Han, talking about ethnic unity, talking about terrorism, talking about a new leadership coming, them asking me, why does no one in the world care? Why is this not a geopolitical issue? Why is no one interested? At the same time, I would ask my students, hands up who's heard of Uyghurs or who knows what a Uyghur is, and you would get no hands apart from maybe Chinese students. So that geopolitics will shape the outcome, but it really had nothing to do with essentially me and researchers who were in the field. In fact, most researchers I met there were completely detached from politics. They were interested in history, language, and cultures. They wondered why a political scientist was coming into the field, eventually wasn't bothered. So I do think geopolitics is not really driving what we do, but it appears that way, and it's really problematic. And it goes back to stuff that other panelists have said. Phil said about Occidentalism and Orientalism. That actually the party state is pumping out lots of propaganda that is essentially Orientalist, essentially frames China in an Orientalist vision, and then the Occident, the West, is the opposite. That's a big problem because it then slot this issue of what happens in China into domestic debates that happen here between left and right, that simply don't apply in China, or race relations in the US that don't apply clearly in China. There's parallels, but they're not the same. So I do push back against the notion that geopolitics is driving the issues or the research, but nevertheless, it is an important context. And it shapes the issue that was brought up at the back about rising economies, government funding. I would say the spirit of academia, as you said, we need to keep it alive. I would say that's why we need academic freedom. We need to push back against state control of these issues. And I don't just mean censorship, I mean actual funding to produce research that cannot be critical. I'm far more worried about basically asinine research that ignores the reality of what's happening on the ground than I am about actual threats. Censorship in that form doesn't scare me. Having to constantly read stuff that's not true and explain to my students, that bothers me. And lastly, the question from Tao is also related to that about funding. Yes, it's academic organization, the way not individual scholars. Can't expect someone who has Chinese family, for example, to suddenly speak out on their own. I would never, ever expect that. I've never asked anyone that. But organizations should be speaking on their behalf because they can. I know Association of Asian Studies was quite supportive. and backs of Jo Smith-Finlay when she was officially sanctioned by the PRC. I don't think that there'll be statements on Rahila Dawit. That seems problematic to me. The only difference being Rahila Dawit is legal.
Thank you. Bill, do you want to come in before we take a last round of questions?
Yeah, I guess as someone who's the closest to a geopolitician, I would say I don't see much evidence that the kind of growing restrictions on research in China is traced to some US-China rivalry, because if that were the case, then people who are not from the US would also have opportunities to go, or that China would probably be trying to use United Front work to separate them from the US and that kind of thing. But the problems are the same for everyone trying to do research in China, regardless of what passport they carry. But the MIT standing up for ethnic Chinese, that was criticizing the US government. That was not criticizing China. So I'm not sure whether that, I would be curious to see whether MIT is criticizing China for academic freedom and other issues. Yeah, I think that China actually has been quite successful in the sort of soft power strategy of funding research from people from Africa, from the global South. And I find it's, there's nothing to criticize in that. I can criticize how they might be shaping it, but the answer to that is to try and get other sources of funding rather than to try and stop that funding. I think the more the merrier in terms of voices on China studies.
Thank you. I think we're going to close for questions there in the interest of handing over a final word to anybody who wants to from the panel. Do you have any final remarks or takeaway points that you'd like us to all bring with us from the panel today?
Yeah, okay, then, fine. No, I haven't prepared any wise words to end with, but I just would stress the need for intellectuals to deal with these issues in a serious manner and not dismiss it as China bashing and geopolitics. Not that we don't need to deal with those questions in context, it matters. But it is an intellectual problem that books that are about China don't talk about Xinjiang, Tibet, Mongolia. I assign Rana Mitter's Bitter Revolution in every course I teach. Best book on modern China. I have to tell my students every year, there's a big problem that he's talking about nation building at the turn of the 20th century and doesn't mention Xinjiang and doesn't mention the nation building processes happening there. We can't theorize Chinese governance without doing that. We only have a partial picture. So regardless of your view on human rights or ethnic politics, I would stress the need for intellectual engagement with issues related to leaders and ethnic politics more generally.
Any other final comments from time?
I would echo Tobin's statements about thinking about these kinds of issues as we talk about China in the contemporary sense, especially thinking about what our responsibilities are to present these as part of the core of the scholarship that needs to be done about contemporary China. So if we're having, for instance, you're assembling an edited volume that's trying to address issues in contemporary China, include scholars who do critical work on ethnic politics, human rights, migration, anything that would include a critical viewpoint about who's core to China's interests, who's marginalized, where are structures of power, et cetera, right? Make sure that these people have a seat at the table, and especially make sure that voices from marginalized communities have a seat at the table. And Tobin has been very forceful in making that point as well, and I want to echo that. We need to make sure that it's not just us speaking about this as well, that we are, encouraging broader inclusion in these conversations. So that's all, I guess.
Yeah, I think I'm echoing precisely what these people are saying and saying that, yeah, I think this is everybody's responsibility. I think awareness of positionality of ourselves and our research is absolutely crucial to make sure that we're basically always thinking about the diversity of what China is, could be, might be, and that making sure that that comes through in our research and how we're presenting it to the world. It's not a call for everybody to suddenly pivot to ethnic politics, but to be aware of how ethnic politics is threaded through sort of what we do everywhere. And also to be aware of like the diversities in China and the Chinese past that we miss when we're not looking for those alternatives, those differences, those other things.
Bill, do you want to come in with final word?
I just want to thank you, Astrid, and for organizing and hosting this, and Tobin for, I think, inspiring this through his work. And yeah, just thank everybody on the panel and the audience.
Thank you very much. Big thanks to the audience and to King's for hosting this important discussion. In a couple of minutes.